But actually, he wasn't boasting. He was right because of all the jobs that he'd done. First Lord of the Admiralty, Secretary of State for War and Air, Minister for Munitions. He'd seen combat up close. He'd been a supporter of the concept of the tank, of naval aviation, of combined operations, all these things. And again, champion of the RAF. So his grounding in all things military was quite remarkable. He really was the right man for the job. I don't know who else could have done it, quite frankly.
Winston Churchill is considered Britain's greatest wartime leader and politician. But the way he was such a hands-on leader during World War II, both as a politician and as a military leader, makes some biographers consider him a warlord. And that's not necessarily meant as a slight. Just like his ally Stalin and his archenemies Hitler and Mussolini, Churchill couldn't help himself and insisted on personally directing the strategic conduct of World War II. For better or for worse, he insisted on being political master and military commander. Again, like his wartime contemporaries, he had a habit of not heeding the advice of his generals. The results of this were disasters in Norway, North Africa, Greece, and Crete during 1940 and 1941. Churchill's pig-headedness over supporting the Italian campaign in defiance of the Riviera landings culminated in his threatening to resign and bring down the British government. But on occasion, he got it just right. He refused to surrender in 1940. He architected the British miracle at Dunkirk, and victory in the Battle of Britain showed that he was a much-needed, decisive leader. And he didn't shy away from difficult decisions, such as the destruction of the French fleet to prevent it from falling into German hands, and his subsequent war against Vichy France. Today's guest is Anthony Tucker Jones, who's author of the new book Churchill, Master and Commander, Winston Churchill at War, 1895 to 1945. We look at his choices in some of the most controversial and high-profile campaigns of World War II, and how in high office his decision-making was both right and wrong. And while he has leadership qualities in common with people like Adolf Hitler, who was also very charismatic and personally led the military effort, Winston Churchill was grounded in a way that Hitler wasn't, allowing him to find success. And as Tucker Jones argues, this made him the right man for the time. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion and looking at different aspects of Winston Churchill. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, Churchill is a multifaceted character, and he has appeared on this podcast many times before as somebody who's overcome great challenges in his life. He seems to be remembered as a motivating figure or speech maker, among many things in the 21st century. And one aspect we're going to discuss for the first time is him as a military tactician and strategist. But before getting into the details of that, something I'm curious about with Churchill is he's part of one of very few figures from the 20th century who has incredible staying power. And I remember when I was reading movie reviews of The King's Speech, which came out about 10 years ago, one of the chief complaints is that some people had incredible issue with the actor Timothy Spall's role as Churchill. They thought that he way overdid it with the mannerisms and the affectations of Churchill. It didn't particularly bother me, but there was something very personal that some people took it. So I think that speaks largely to Churchill remaining a character that affects people really on a personal level after all these decades. So what do you think it is about Churchill that does that even to this day in 2021?
I mean, I think Churchill, if you like, he's your archetypal spin doctor, because from the word go, he very much managed not only his career, but his image. And so he sort of created for himself this larger-than-life character, which for some people rubbed them up the wrong way. Some people warmed to him. But he was very much a sort of love him or hate him type figure. And of course, in recent years, he's become a bit of a divisive figure. But he very much was his own man, I think. Some people liked that and some didn't. As you know, he had a reputation for changing political parties, which made him unpopular. He could be autocratic at times, but he took his role as a leader, particularly during the Second World War, very seriously.
Well, I'll be interested to explore parts of his character, which you describe in very interesting ways, that he was first and foremost a warlord, which isn't necessarily a negative thing based on the context in which he's leading. But for your description of him as a military commander, let's go back to the beginning. And he first enters the public consciousness as a correspondent in the Boer War. But what are things that you would point to early in his life that shape him as a military commander?
It's one of those sort of fallacies that I think he really did have a sense of destiny. And I think very much deep down, he wanted to be a military man from the word go. But his military career wasn't actually that long. obviously his connection with the armed forces was quite considerable. But as a man in uniform, it didn't last very long. But as a young man in his early 20s, one of the things he was very, very, very keen on was winning medals. And obviously he wasn't alone in that. Lots of young officers joining their regiments, that's what all they wanted, to see action and to gain glory. But the thing that's quite remarkable about Churchill is the lengths that he went to try and win. I mean, his heart was set on a Victoria Cross or a Distinguished Service Order, which are Britain's two highest military awards. And he wanted those, I think, to help boost a military career. But in the back of his mind, he always wanted to embark on a political career as well. And he knew that by winning something like the Victoria Cross, of course, it would bring him great publicity and bring him to public notice. It would also, of course, confirm his status as a war hero if he won a VC.
All right, so let's talk about the early stages of his military career. And I would like this to be a lead into the Battle of Gallipoli, which, if listeners want an incredible amount of context on that, they can listen to the 25 or 30 part series that I did with James Early, Key Battles of World War I, of which Gallipoli has its own episode. And I mentioned Mustafa Kemal Ataturk so much in that episode that it essentially becomes a drinking game. But tell me about the lead up to and then including the Battle of Gallipoli, please.
The thing that struck me when I was researching the Battle of Gallipoli, it's well known, it went horribly wrong. The operation caused bad blood between Great Britain and some of the Dominion countries, most principally, of course, Australia and New Zealand, who provided the Anzac Corps. But what struck me was, of course, is that Churchill has gone down in history as the architect and the culprit of the operations in the Dardanelles, whereas actually that's very much unfair. He certainly was a driving factor in the early part of the operation. But the fact that it went wrong wasn't really his fault. It was always really envisaged as a combined operation involving the Army and the Navy, which, of course, in those days was a fairly new concept to the Royal Navy, the Army and the Marines. They'd cooperated in the past, but not on a scale that they envisaged for the Dardanelles. But the problem that Churchill had was that there was a lot of foot dragging by both the Royal Navy and the Army in getting resources in place. Obviously, the Allies were tied up on the Western Front, and there wasn't really much to spare. So there was much wrangling on whether or not the Dardanelles could be forced purely by the Royal Navy or whether they needed a land attack as well. And obviously, Churchill, really, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was the driving force behind the naval side of things, and not really the ground force. And obviously, he ended up losing his post as First Sea Lord over the whole thing. The Navy basically pulled the rug from under him. Likewise did the Army. And I think the salutary lesson that Churchill learned from Gallipoli was that, in a way, and this is something that, of course, he brought to bear during the Second World War, is that running military campaigns by committee is a recipe for disaster, that it has to be pushed along decisively with clear goals, a clear commitment in resources. And I think that was a fundamental lesson that Churchill learned. Unfortunately, of course, it did him politically a great deal of damage for a number of years. Ironically, there was, I'm sure you're aware, a detailed inquiry afterwards that more or less exonerated him. But of course, in history, he's gone down as the culprit for that and takes the blame for it. But I think that's unfair. But I think the other key important thing that came out of the whole affair was the fact that he drew some very important lessons, which actually served him well in later life.
Right. And that'll be an interesting thing to see, for good or for ill, how much he goes based on his own intuition and his own research without the advice of generals, which leaders, whether Abraham Lincoln or others, have been criticized both ways for either heeding the advice or heeding too closely the advice of those around them. But before exiting this era of World War I, there's a lot of mythology around Winston Churchill's influence on the creation of the modern Middle East, with the incredible influence that Britain has over colonies, over the creation of these borders that exist in the Middle East today between nations. Some of them seemingly almost arbitrarily drawn with the fallout of the Ottoman Empire, areas which there were ethnic populations which existed historically that sometimes were cut right down the middle, such as the Kurdish people, and creating many of the divisions that we have today, where there are nation states such as Iraq, where there are different populations that really don't have a unified history. There's apocryphal stories that Winston Churchill was drunk when he was drawing up the map of the Middle East, and that's why there's squiggly lines around part of Jordan, which is a wonderful tale. It makes no sense whatsoever. But what was his role, and where do some of these stories come from?
Well, again, of course, Churchill was, I think, Secretary of the Colonies when in the early 1920s, I think it was 21, was the Cairo Conference. And obviously in the aftermath of the First World War, there was the tricky business of dividing up the Ottoman Empire. Again, as I'm sure you're aware, of course, the Ottoman Empire had become the Republic of Turkey and was embroiled in a number of wars with its neighbours. But the Allies were left obviously in control of the Middle East, and there was the problem of what to do with Mesopotamia and the Levant, which of course subsequently became Syria, Iraq and Lebanon. And again, it's one of those interesting stories that when I looked into the creation, particularly of Iraq, is that Churchill's held up as the blame. Again, obviously his adherence to the creation of Israel. He carried the blame for that in popular perception. But in fact, he took an army of experts with him, which included T.E. Lawrence, of course, Lawrence of Arabia, who was an Arab specialist, and also Gertrude Bell, who also was a specialist in the region. And he was reliant in many ways on their advice on what to do with the region. Part of the problem that Churchill had was, of course, it was really a case of realpolitik, in that Britain was pretty much bankrupt after the First World War, limited resources, rocketing costs on policing the British Empire and other territories that had been given to govern. So Churchill was looking for, if you like, a quick fix for the Middle East, and certainly one that would help guarantee British security in that part of the world. And of course, that was the main driving factor, particularly in terms of course, safeguarding Suez, because during the First World War, the Turks had launched a campaign from Palestine to try and take the canal. So Churchill's strategic thinking, of course, was how to safeguard Britain's position, particularly in Egypt, and also, of course, the mandate with Palestine, what to do with that. And also, of course, the issue of what to do with regions which were not really nation states. I mean, they didn't exist as such. They were sort of kingdoms, tribal kingdoms, which paid historically lip service to the Ottoman Empire. So the problem Churchill had was, how did he create a security buffer for British interests? But of course, it wasn't only Britain that had an interest in that part of the world. The French, obviously, were given a mandate over Syria, which created problems, and Lebanon. So there was these sort of competing European interests. And also someone like Lawrence, obviously, he wanted to see a unified Arab state. But he himself had discovered that when he got to Damascus with the Arab army, that the Arabs themselves, of course, again, were not a unified nation. And he found trying to get them to cooperate was very difficult. The Arabs themselves didn't really kind of know what it was that they wanted created in that part of the world. And of course, the upshot was that the spoils of war really were parcelled off to members of the royal family who'd supported the Allied cause, and in some cases, of course, foisted kings onto countries that had no connection with their new rulers, which created a lot of problems. And of course, as you rightly said, has since led to problems in modern times, and indeed, of course, made life quite tricky for Britain and the Allies during the Second World War. We can come back to that if you like, but of course, obviously led to military campaigns against what became a pro-Nazi Iraq and indeed Vichy-controlled Lebanon and Syria. But I think Churchill, my impression is that he acted with the best of intentions. To be fair to him, it was really an impossible task, quite frankly. There's been much criticism of what he did and obviously the historical fallout. But I think pretty much I'm at a loss to suggest anything that he could have done better, quite frankly. You certainly could have jiggled the borders in that part of the world around some of the tribal areas, perhaps. But one of the interesting things was that actually he steered well away of keeping involved in Saudi Arabia, which of course had yet to discover very large quantities of oil, simply because he appreciated that it would be, apart from the sort of peripheral provinces, that it would be a massive security headache if Britain got involved in the interior, in the desert quarter. It just would have been an even worse proposition than the one that we had on our hands.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. In some senses, it's easy to chide him for all the mistakes he made. And as newspaper columnists talked about the wars in Iraq and elsewhere, that these are nations that don't have the inherent stability that, let's say, a nation based on an ethno-national consciousness like Serbia would be, if you have different ethnic groups of people that don't have a common heritage. That it's easy to armchair quarterback, but this issue of what Europeans of the 19th century called the Eastern question for decades and decades and decades, what to do about the Ottoman Empire as our colonies grow? Do we just take part of it? Do we encourage them to become a constitutional monarchy, more along the lines of a nation state? And as the collapse of the foreign policy consensus has shown after Afghanistan, as we're recording here in September 2021, no easy answers. So yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
No, I mean,
So
in any,
yeah,
sorry,
please.
I was just simply going to say, historically, the problem we always have is that any military intervention comes at a cost. And of course, it's knowing when to leave. And that's always a political decision. It's a political decision when to send the troops in. And it's a political decision when to withdraw them. And as you rightly pointed out, of course, a lot of the newer nation states that sort of created in the early 20th century, they don't have that sort of historical, cultural common grounding amongst them. Nation states take a long time to become a unified, coherent state. The United Kingdom's been through it, America's been through it, France, Italy, Germany. They all originated as sort of a conglomerate of principalities, and it's taken a long time to fuse them in together to the point where they have a common national identity. And going back to the Middle East, and like you said, with the Ottoman Empire, of course, what the West created were artificial political creations, but there wasn't anything else there really to work with. And again, historically, of course, what we've seen is a lot of those sorts of states that were, if you like, artificial political constructs. The only way they tended, unfortunately, to stay together was when they had a strong man ruling them. So somewhere like the Yugoslavia, obviously, the minute Tito died, it collapsed. Iraq, the minute Saddam Hussein died, it collapsed. Somewhere like Libya, the minute Gaddafi died, it collapsed. So it's very difficult to get the building blocks for a modern state in place with a recognised judiciary, infrastructure, central government, taxation system, all those things that make our modern states work. For a lot of the newer states, of course, they didn't have those building blocks, if you like, or like you say, indeed, that sort of common national heritage that brought people together. And quite often what we did was a lot of the areas that were brought together as nations, of course, actually within them had long-standing religious and political hatreds. Again, if we go back to the Balkans, obviously somewhere like Yugoslavia, where there had long been tension between, Muslim and Christian populations. And again, as we saw when Yugoslavia came apart, those tensions came to a boil, which really, of course, were historical bad blood, if you like, that had dated from the Middle Ages. So going back to my original point with Churchill, I personally think he made the best of a bad job, quite frankly. And again, to be fair, he was chairing the conference, but he wasn't the only one there. There was an army of representatives from across the British military, British government departments, all there having their say, trying to guide him. Obviously, because he was the man in the hot seat, he's the one that carried the can. I mean, again, interestingly, going back to the point of trying to address British security needs in that region because of the Suez Canal and indeed the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, whatever you want to call it these days. Britain had naval bases in that part of the world. So having Iraq with a friendly government obviously worked to British overseas interests. But the problem with somewhere like Iraq, of course, was policing it. Again, at that stage, it had no national sense of identity. And as you mentioned, of course, the Kurds in the north ended up the largest ethnic group in the world without nation statehood. They ended up divided between Syria, Iran, Iraq and Turkey. I mean, they ended up scattered all over the place. But in the case of Egypt, of course, Churchill was subsequently get himself into trouble because he became an advocate of what was called air control, which was to use the RAF to patrol the Iraqi tribes and try and keep law and order. And one of the main reasons, of course, he did that, well, there were two reasons, key reasons, one of which was to try and keep the RAF in being after the First World War because it was costing an arm and a leg and the British government wanted to make savings. And one of those would have been to disband the RAF and simply absorb the air wings back into the army and the navy, and that it would lose its identity. And also, of course, to save money in Iraq. So Churchill, along with Lord Trenchard, of course, they found a good use for the RAF. And again, it was Trenchard that came up with air control. It wasn't Churchill. I mean, Churchill gets the blame for implementing it, but it's actually Trenchard who was looking for a rationale for the RAF to continue after the First World War. And one of those he quite reasoned was, well, could the RAF not help with police operations across the British Empire? You'd have a few RAF squadrons here. If there was trouble broke out, then they could be deployed a lot quicker than armed forces. You need fewer aircraft, etc. So at the time, it seemed a good idea. But of course, since it's become a bit of a political hot potato because inevitably there were civilian losses. Bombing targets is indiscriminate. It's not ideal. But of course, in many ways of taking that decision over implementing air control, it helped save the RAF and of course sowed the seeds for fighter command, which proved instrumental in defending Britain during 1940 and the Battle of Britain. So it's funny how those quirks of fate have a knock-on effect subsequently, which actually turn out to be quite important.
Well, there's a book called Churchill, the Prophetic Statesman that argues that really tries to place him as a visionary, which you can make the argument for if you look exclusively at the ways that he got things right, which having a more independent Air Force, which the United States does not have throughout World War II. And taking it far enough, you could say that he's envisioning police support and police pursuit with helicopters overhead, trying to track people down. But looking ahead to this period, the 1920s and into the 1930s, biographers of Churchill focus on his wilderness years that informs his character when he's out of power, and it makes him who he is as a statesman in the 1940s. You looking at him as a military commander, what do you make of his wilderness years and the impact that it had on him?
That was quite interesting, actually, because obviously he's out of office and he's not holding any senior military posts. He's no longer First Sea Lord, Colonial Secretary. He's not Minister for Munitions. He's not Secretary of State for War or Air. So effectively, he sat on the sidelines. It has to be said entirely his own fault because of his views over India. But what he did do, certainly during the First World War, he supported the creation of the British intelligence services, most notably MI5 and MI6, or at least what became those organisations. And as a favour, they kept him, and also, of course, they knew that politically he was useful, lobbying from the back benches. But as a favour, they kept him pretty well informed about the growth of Nazi Germany. And obviously, he became a prophet of doom and gloom, and subsequently, of course, was proved right. But the interesting fact of that, of course, is that actually he was well informed. So he wasn't just being a merchant of doom and gloom on a whim. So he was very well plugged into what was happening to Nazi Germany. Obviously, he'd been there during the First World War. He knew how Germany had been treated. He knew how the Weimar Republic had failed. He knew all about the Bolshevik threat from the East. He still was a very vocal opponent to Bolshevism. He was very anti-Soviet Union. But what I found quite interesting, actually, was he's famous for his dire warnings about the rise of Nazi Germany. What he wasn't so good with was the Far East. And in fact, he sort of pegged his colours to the Japanese cause, and he got that horribly wrong, in that he felt that China was in such a state of chaos, thanks to the civil war there, that actually Japan could be a force for good, which actually was obviously woefully mistaken. He'd witnessed the Japanese taking over Korea and then occupying large areas of Manchuria. And there wasn't really any way to justify that. But he seemed to think actually it was quite a good thing. He even blamed the performance of Chinese armies on their history of pacifism, which again was far from the truth. The Chinese lost simply because they did not have modern, well-equipped armies. They had very large armies, and their armies were basically large numbers of infantry division. What they lacked, of course, was well-trained, well-equipped troops with tanks and aircraft and artillery, which is what the Japanese had. And of course, they were able to use them as a force multiplier, which time and again gave them victory. So what it meant was that Churchill misjudged that growing threat from Japan in the Far East. And obviously the Japanese had their long-term strategy of turn north, which would have taken them into the Soviet Union, or turn south back into China, and then obviously into the Far East, into Western colonial interests there. So it meant fundamentally Churchill during the wilderness years, he woefully underestimated Japan posed to British interests, most principally, of course, Singapore, which Britain would end up losing once Japan entered the Second World War. So the development of his strategic thinking during that sort of 10-year period when he was out of power is quite interesting. He was very focused on maybe his understanding on the rest of the world wasn't so good. Again, to be fair to the man, he was pretty clued up on what was going on in the Mediterranean. And Mussolini had been in power since the 1920s, so he was fully aware of the threat that Mussolini posed. And of course, Britain had acquiesced in Mussolini taking over Libya and Abyssinia. And Churchill always thought that was a mistake because obviously Britain had shown weakness in the Mediterranean. And Mussolini felt he could capitalise on that, which of course he did. Shortly after Hitler invaded France, Mussolini got in on the fun and attacked southern France, but also, of course, attacked British-controlled Egypt from Libya. And one of the things, of course, Churchill did was, no pun intended, but he firmly drew a line in the sand in North Africa, in that he was determined that he would defeat the Italians, which of course he subsequently did. So I think Mediterranean Europe during his wilderness years, his time was well spent. He fully understood what the Germans were doing. He was well conversant on the threat from their rearmament, their insistence on reclaiming lost German lands, the reabsorption of Volksdeutsch into the integrated Germany, the Rhineland, Sudetenland, all those areas that it's slowly reclaimed. He understood the threat. Same with Italy. He understood the threat. But the one thing he did get wrong was the threat posed by Japan. So although he had a very good, I think, world outlook, again, he understood America. He understood, being half American, he understood America pretty well, I think, and had obviously visited a lot of times. He also understood America's growing military power. At that time, certainly during the 30s, America understandably was very adverse to getting involved in another European war, and that was quite understandable after what happened during the First World War. But even then, Churchill understood that America had the industrial might that Britain would need to help defeat the threat of Nazism and fascism. So sort of looking to North America, Europe, and the Mediterranean, his grasp, I think, on the developing situation was good, whereas actually in the Far East, it was very poor.
One thing real quick with that on his perception of Imperial Japan, something I was surprised by in a series I did on World War II in the Pacific with, again, my co-host James Early, who did the World War I series. Churchill commented it was after Japan's supernova expansion, after Pearl Harbor and the conquest of Guam, of Hong Kong, Indochina, and other places. There's a British ship that sunk, and I forget the name of it, but Churchill later commented that he was more devastated by that than anything else. And this is someone who survives the Battle of Britain after relentless bombing of London and all of the hardships he experienced in World War II. It was a British ship that was sunk near India or somewhere around the Pacific theater that rattled him the most, which I was very surprised by. Was it because he was so blindsided by Japan that affected him, or was it something else?
That's a good question. The irony is with Churchill, of course, is that he'd been one of the proponents of naval air power. So during the First World War, he was a big supporter of the development of the early carriers. What he, of course, didn't appreciate really was actually the power that those aircraft carriers could bring. So he misunderstood the threat posed to the Royal Navy if it operated in the Far East without an aircraft carrier. And of course, that's what happened with the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, is that Japanese carriers caught them. And he was horrified. And with his sort of admiral hat on, if you like, he'd sort of naively assumed, I think, that if he sent that sort of battle fleet flotilla down there, it would be sufficient deterrent to keep the Japanese away from Singapore. But it simply didn't work. And again, it's one of his miscalculations, is that really he, of all people, should have known. They had allocated the battle group a carrier, but it wasn't available, and the things had sailed on their own. In the case of Singapore, I think the air cover wasn't adequate. All these kind of problems that mounted up. And Churchill knew in his heart that ultimately, when it came to safeguarding Britain's strategic interests, he could do one or two things. It was either Cairo or it was Singapore. And he knew deep down that we simply didn't have the resources to hold Singapore. In fact, I think he said, I'm going from memory here, but it was something like, he said it was like choosing which daughter was to be sacrificed. They were both jewels in the crown of the British Empire, if you like, key naval ports. But he knew we simply did not have the money and the resources to defend Singapore properly. It's not that we didn't try, and certainly it wasn't for the want of trying that he did. But in terms of the resources that Britain was able to devote to defending Singapore, they simply weren't enough. And as you say, with the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, he kind of hoped that them just showing up would be enough, and it simply wasn't. And again, he should have really seen the warning signs with the Norwegian campaign, where the Luftwaffe extracted a heavy toll on the Royal Navy. They were obviously able to operate from land air bases and strike the Royal Navy while we were fighting the Germans in Norway. And I think maybe Churchill, to a lesser extent, missed the warning signs. I mean, he got it right in terms of the Mediterranean. We were able to get carriers in there, and they did sterling service. They helped keep Malta replenished. They helped safeguard the convoys. They helped safeguard Alexandria and Cairo. So he got it right there. But in the Middle East, it went horribly wrong. And as you rightly pointed out, it haunted him for a long time after. That's the burden of being in power. You're in the hot seat. He was prime minister. And also, of course, the other thing is it's important to remember, and it's something I brought out in the book, is he created the post of defence minister. He was Britain's very first defence minister. And that goes back to our conversation about Gallipoli, is that he wanted to be advised by the chiefs of staff and all the other military committees. But ultimately, he knew he needed to be at the top of the food chain and make those decisions. So what he did was, in a way, he circumvented the chiefs of staff by making all the service heads answer directly to him as defence minister. So he became dual-hatted, for the Second World War, which is what fed the title of the book, Master and Commander. Well, it's political master and military commander, and he did that deliberately. That's something that he did with both eyes open, is that he realised that there would be hard decisions to make and he would need to make them sometimes quite quickly. The wrangling that took place for a lot of campaigns, it delayed things. And again, in the back of his mind, he had Gallipoli, in that he knew there'd been so much toing and froing on what was achievable, what wasn't achievable, what resources would be committed, what resources wouldn't be committed, that ultimately, of course, when they did commit themselves to do it, the whole thing came off the rails.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, this gets to the heart of your book, that in some ways his conduct is similar to a Hitler or Mussolini, that Churchill is personally directing the strategic conduct of World War II in a way that's different than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who allows his generals or his admirals a fair amount of leeway or discretion. And with this are enormous advantages and disadvantages. So I would love for you to, as you do in your book, audit the successes and failures of this approach.
Problem that Churchill had was, obviously his job was to make difficult political and military decisions, having made himself defence minister. The net result of that was, of course, he didn't always agree with his service chiefs and felt, as the top man, it was up to him on best available evidence to make difficult decisions. And as we've discussed, on occasions he got that just right, and on occasions he didn't. A prime example of getting it right, obviously, was facing down Hitler in sort of May, June 1940, when he became prime minister. And obviously he had a lot of appeasement ministers. He still had Chamberlain and he had Lord Halifax in his cabinet. And he had to go through the motions of maybe negotiating with Hitler. I personally don't think he was ever sincere in that. Over the years, there have been quite a few books that have explored, did he ever waver? Did maybe in the back of his mind, was he prepared to seek peace with Hitler? My reading and my personal view is no, he didn't. He went through the motions because obviously initially his position was not particularly secure. He had to keep on board the appeasers. And until such time as he'd consolidated his position, he needed to explore all of the avenues. So my feeling with that is he was going through the motions. But of course, what he did do was he took that fateful decision to rescue the British armed forces, obviously to the detriment of the French situation in Northern Europe. And he also took the decision that we would resist Hitler's air onslaught. The decision to evacuate Dunkirk was a difficult one because initially he was trying to bolster the French to resist longer, while behind the scenes, obviously, he was getting his chiefs to organise the practicalities of evacuating the British Expeditionary Force. And obviously, for political reasons, didn't tell the French until the last minute. But of course, what it did was, by rescuing as many troops as he could, it kept Britain in the war. It was a defeat, but of course it boosted British morale. I mean, even Churchill warned the House of Commons afterwards, withdrawals do not make victories. But the point was, we'd saved a big chunk of our manpower. And also, after a difficult decision, they'd withdrawn most of the RAF and refused to commit any more RAF squadrons to the defence of French airspace. Again, it was a difficult decision for Churchill to make, but he knew that Luftwaffe would soon be attacking British targets and therefore had to husband the RAF's resources, which he did. So that was his trial by fire, if you like, that the minute he was in the hot seat, he had those two difficult things to oversee. And then at the same time, of course, Mussolini launched his attack on Egypt, so he was distracted by that. He had to figure out what we could do because our resources at that time in Egypt were absolutely tiny. The Desert Force there ended up mustering about 30,000 men, whereas the Italians had 250,000 across the border. So again, touch and go. It really looked like there was a good chance that Egypt could fall to the Italians. The irony is, going back to my comments about Chinese armies, the Italians actually were very similar in that they were heavy on infantry, but were not really mechanized. They didn't have much in the way of wheeled transport. Their tank force was fairly fledgling. It was only just beginning. So unfortunately for Churchill, whereas of course Hitler's blitzkrieg in Europe had wreaked havoc across the Low Countries and into France, Mussolini's blitzkrieg actually ground to a halt very quickly. Once he was inside the Egyptian border, he came to a stop. So those were kind of all successes. Where it started to come off the rails a bit, of course, was he got Roosevelt and Eisenhower to agree to a Mediterranean first campaign, in that they would clear the access out of the Med. That was particularly problematic once the Germans were in Tunisia. So it was a good idea to clear the Germans out of North Africa. It secured the whole of the North African littoral, so the entire coastline came under Allied control. But that wasn't handled very well, of course, because the Germans got into Tunisia pretty quickly and saved Rommel and dragged that campaign out much longer than it needed to. It lasted around till, May 43. And then, of course, Churchill then prevailed that we should attack Sicily. Well, that went pretty well. Obviously, British and American armies in the race to Messina. But unfortunately, most of the German forces and a lot of the Italians escaped across to the mainland in Italy. And then Churchill became wed to this strategic notion that a good idea would be to strike up through Italy and the Balkans into southern Germany, and that would bring the war to a rapid end, which in theory seemed like a good idea. But of course, he didn't take into account really the fact that much of Italy is mountains. Running down that central spine of the Italian boot are mountains, which presented the Germans with ideal defence positions and unending stop points. And as we both know, the Allies ended up bottled up in Italy. But of course, he supported D-Day. He understood the need for opening a second front in Northern Europe. And he, like Roosevelt, had committed himself with Stalin that the Allies would do their utmost to open a second front. And again, as I'm sure you're aware, that kept slipping, much to Stalin's irritation. But one thing Churchill did was he then opposed the landings in southern France, on the Riviera, which were supposedly to have been conducted at the same time as D-Day. And Churchill was adamant that they shouldn't take place because he was cross that Allied forces, the forces to use in those landings came from Italy. And that brought everything to a head with the Americans in that, poor old Eisenhower was an absolute saint, quite frankly, having to put up with Churchill and the likes of Montgomery. He was a great staff officer and a great diplomat. I mean, that was one of his strengths. And thank goodness for the Allied cause that we had him, in that post as Allied Supreme Commander. But Churchill basically threw his toys out of the pram and went to Eisenhower and basically said, if we go ahead with the Riviera landings, I'm going to resign and bring the British government down. I mean, it was an appalling ultimatum to present to Eisenhower. Eisenhower quite rightly stuck to his guns, and those landings took place. As it turned out, they were largely nugatory because all the better units had already been drawn north to the fighting in Normandy. But it's at that point, I think, clearly Churchill's influence on the fighting was beginning to wane. In terms of his other failures, he conducted an ill-fated campaign in the Greek islands. That didn't go very well. Italy, that the Germans held on there till the last, so that never really proved decisive. So he got a lot of the stuff right a lot of the time, but he also got a lot of things wrong a lot of the time as well. But again, as I've argued in the book, that's the nature of the beast, in that he had to make difficult choices and they weren't always the right ones.
Well, this gets to a very interesting question because other leaders have prosecuted their wars in a similar way that Churchill did. In fact, Hitler did to the complete disaster of Germany. When some historians are asked, could Germany have ever won World War II? There's no consensus, but a similar answer I read is that, well, if he left it to his generals and they prosecuted a very different war where the aims were far more modest, recapture different parts of the Rhineland, different parts of historical, ethnically German places in Europe, then perhaps. And if Hitler would have just been the champion of his people as a charismatic figure, but left all matters of strategy to his generals, it could have been done better. Churchill occupies both of these, and a lot of the mythology built around him is that he's a world historical figure who was the right man at the right time. He kept the resolve and the backbone during the darkest days of Britain in 1940. And if not for him, and if Britain would have made peace, then that could have imperiled the entire war effort, which, I mean, there's an argument to be made there. So how much do you make of that for Churchill, that the way that he conducted the war, was it the best way that it could have been done? Was he the right man at the time? Could somebody else who had led the war effort differently been successful in a different way, or perhaps even more successful? So what do you make of all this?
Scott, you make a very good point in your analogy between Churchill, Hitler and Stalin. Because as you rightly point out, one of Hitler's major failings was he micromanaged the German war effort. And in fact, as the war went on, he got worse to the detriment of the German war effort. One of his main mantras was never give ground, which of course deprived his generals of the initiative all the time, particularly by 44, when we're firmly looking at what we in modern parlance is maneuver warfare, that you need to keep your forces on the move in order to wrong foot the enemy. The minute you start fighting a static battle, you're going to lose. So that's what Hitler did with his generals, is that simply wouldn't give ground. So he took all flexibility and initiative off them. The irony is when his generals did disobey him, they actually managed to pull a rabbit from the hat. So a prime example of that would be Kharkov in early 1943, when they gave the Red Army a bloody nose after withdrawing and then counterattacking against Hitler's orders. Whereas Stalin tried to micromanage the Soviet Union's war effort at the beginning and very quickly realized he wasn't qualified to do that. So he managed Soviet strategy in the run-up to the German invasion and got it horribly wrong. He convinced himself Hitler was not going to attack him. His generals kept telling him otherwise, to the extent they were not allowed to mobilize the Red Army. So what they did was, to get around it, they conducted a number of very large-scale exercises in the Western Soviet Union in an effort to try and prepare. But of course, actually, that didn't work because the Germans caught them before those units had fully deployed for the exercises. But as the Soviet Union suffered increasing defeats during 1941-42, Stalin gradually began to step back when he began to recognize that generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky knew what they were doing and were very competent. So he increasingly relied on his generals to get the work done and then took the credit, as you'd expect from a dictator. Whereas with Churchill, yes, in the initial stages, he tried to micromanage the war. He did take advice. But of course, by 44, particularly once America was the superior partner, he increasingly didn't meddle in Allied strategy. He was desperate to be a spectator. D-Day is a prime example of that. Desperately wanted to attend D-Day till he was talked out of it. For something like Operation Market Garden and the Arnhem operation, he was out of country. I think he was in the States at the time when that took place, so he had no bearing on that. And again, by the time the Rhine crossings, that was firmly in the hands of British and American generals. And again, he went along as a spectator. So he certainly sort of 1940 to 42, he was very firmly directing the war as it progressed. Certainly by sort of mid-43, I think his influence was waning. And to be fair, probably for the best. I mean, the point by that stage was we were firmly fighting coalition warfare. So Churchill was not really in a position to call the shots. As we've discussed, he tried on a number of occasions, but even he recognised that the Allied war effort was increasingly being run by a committee. It had to be. It was the very nature of the Allied war effort. But as you rightly say, was your other question, was he the right man at the right time, the right place? Yes. I mean, that's what I argue in my book, and it's one of the central theses. Because everything he'd done in his life, there's that corny quote from him, isn't there, about when he was called to be Prime Minister, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but words to the effect of his destiny was calling, and all that had gone before led to that very moment. Well, the man was the master of the soundbite. We've got to this day numerous Churchill quote books, with pithy sound bites. I mean, he was the master of the soundbite. As I said earlier, he was a brilliant spin doctor. But actually, he wasn't boasting. He was right because of all the jobs that he'd done. First Lord of the Admiralty, Secretary of State for War and Air, Minister for Munitions. He'd seen combat up close. He'd been a supporter of the concept of the tank, of naval aviation, of combined operations, all these things. And again, champion of the RAF. So his grounding in all things military was quite remarkable. He really was the right man for the job. I don't know who else could have done it, quite frankly. The favourite, obviously, at the time was Lord Halifax, whereas I don't think he really wanted the job. Politically wise, there were problems for him doing it anyway because he was a member of the Lords, and the Prime Minister is always selected from a member of Parliament from the Commons. So there was no precedent for Lord Halifax becoming Prime Minister. Maybe they could have passed emergency legislation for him to do it. But, I mean, he certainly didn't have the breadth of knowledge or experience, or indeed, certainly in Churchill's case, the strategic outlook, as we've discussed, obviously, he didn't always get it right, but he had a very good grasp of world affairs. He had, a remarkable understanding for military affairs, land, air, and sea. So, God bless him. In my mind, he certainly was in the right place at the right time. And hopefully I argue that convincingly in the book. Again, it goes back to the title of master and commander. He just happened to be so well qualified, he rose to the occasion. And earlier you were saying about some people didn't like him. Well, his working practices were quite remarkable. I mean, he's in his 60s when he became prime minister. His energy and his drive was just quite remarkable. And I think that's what a lot of people find inspiring about him. You know, he was a bit of a polymath. He was a painter, he was a writer, he was a soldier, he was a journalist. It was bricklayer, you know, you name it, he had a go at it. But his sense of duty and his dedication to the office, it was just quite remarkable. I mean, he drove his senior commanders mad of the late hours that he did. You know, he'd quite often invite people down to Chequers or Chartwell, the PM's home in his own home, to have dinner and a bit of a chat and watch a movie into late at night, would then discuss the war and then send his senior commanders home at 2 a.m, 4 a.m. sometimes. If you read someone like Arthur Harris's memoirs, you know, the Bomber Harrison Commander, Bomber Command, you know, he said he found Churchill an absolute fascinating character and an inspiration, but he would regularly leave Churchill absolutely exhausted and dreading the fact that the following day he was after going to go and oversee, you know, operations that were life and death for his air crews, courtesy of Churchill, who had no concept that it was a good idea to get a good night's sleep and be up bright and breezy in the morning. Whereas Montgomery, someone like Field Marshal Montgomery, was of the other school who insisted on going to bed early and not being disturbed and getting a good night's sleep. So, you know, he was as rested as he could be and his brain was clear for the day ahead. So you've got to give it to Churchill. You know, a lesser man would have buckled. I mean, you know, even after the war. And then again, on top of that, you have to add his myriad of ill health problems. You know, as it's well known, during the Second World War, he was not a well man. His lifestyle didn't help. You know, he was liked to smoke, liked to drink, but then so did everyone else during that time. But obviously that came at a cost, you know. So he was quite regularly ill, had pneumonia, heart problems, you know, and yet he soldiered on. You know, you can't imagine people doing that now. They'd be signed off 6 trail.
Right. I mean, that really speaks to his character or his incredible energy that he can lead a war effort, give speeches, rally the people, speak before Parliament, entertain for several hours, and doing all these things while keeping up a very heavy drinking schedule and heavy smoking schedule too. So, and as your point earlier, that someone who's an incredibly charismatic people who can rally them, it is a rare quality that they can do that. And we have a lot of people like that in history, like going back to ancient Greece, Demosthenes, who convinces Athens to fight against Philip of Macedon, which is a terrible decision. So he's charismatic, but he's a terrible strategist. Same with Hitler as well. But Churchill manages to be an incredibly inspiring figure, understands maybe a bit of his world historical importance, but manages to be grounded enough that he can realistically lead his nations when he needs to, which, as you described, is a rare combination. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot here to unpack about him. And we know he's a complicated figure, but there's always new things to unpack with Churchill. And for listeners who want to get into that story, the name of your book is Churchill, Master and Commander. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me on.
All right, listeners. Well, that is all that I have for today's episode. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Bill Ivey, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tom from Ohio, Ryan Gillen, Rob from Chicago, Nick Brooks, Michael from New York, Carl from Norway, Josh Reddick, Jennifer French-Lee, Jay Carrington, McCrays, Salvador Sanchez, David Santi, Chris C., and Baron Fraser. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also, I have exclusive content there, such as live streams where I do live versions of podcast episodes where you can leave feedback as I'm talking, and I will address it on air. Last, and I think this is the best, is to join our membership program, the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were George Washington's spies during the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program for History Unplugged. If you go to patreon.com/unplugged, you can join the membership program at 3 levels. If you join at the Scout level, you'll get all 400 episodes of History Unplugged absolutely ad-free and early access to new episodes. If you join at the 2nd level, the Intelligence Officer level, get all the stuff that Scouts get, along with bonus episodes. There's currently about 40 of them, including series on Audie Murphy and Operation Long Jump about the Nazi attempt to assassinate FDR, Churchill, and Stalin in 1943. Finally, if you join at the Spy Master level, you'll get a shout-out to you and or your business at the end of each episode. You get a 3-pack of hardcover history books, and you can find out what those are if you go to patreon.com/unplugged. Finally, you can ask me a question about history on absolutely any topic on Earth, and I will research it and devote an entire episode to your question. Probably about 30% of the questions in the archive for the show have been based on these sorts of questions. So there you go. Go to patreon.com/unplugged to learn more.